You knew exactly how much Hershey's syrup to pour before the milk turned the right shade of brown, and you could roll a slice of Wonder Bread flat in one motion without tearing it. Nobody taught you that. You just watched. Here are 30 easy 1980s after-school snacks no one makes anymore. Ants on a log sounds like something a camp counselor invented on a dare, but from the 1950s onward, it was the snack that taught American kids that cooking could mean assembly, not heat. You split a celery stalk, dragged a butter knife heavy with peanut butter through the groove until full, and lined the raisins up one by one, never dumping them, always placing, because the spacing was the whole point. The Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink traces the name to a Minneapolis Star-Tribune article from February of 1959, where a family described it as something children had started making themselves. The Girl Scouts had a version in their cookbooks as far back as 1946, though they just called it celery sticks. What the name added was theater. By the 1980s, it had moved from summer camp to every kitchen in America, every kid making it the same way. Deliberate raisin placement, as if rules existed. They did. Nobody wrote them down. Cinnamon toast made under the broiler is not the same as cinnamon toast from a toaster. And if you grew up in a kitchen where someone made it right, you already know that. You laid the bread on the oven rack, spread butter heavy enough to pool in the center, covered it with white sugar, and shook cinnamon over until the color looked right. 30 seconds under the broiler was the difference between a crackling amber crust and a scorched disaster. You watched through the glass. When the sugar bubbled and darkened at the edges, you pulled it out. The broiled method came from Depression-era kitchens where the oven was already on, and it made its way through the decades as the version your mother made when you came home sick from school. The toaster version tastes like seasoned bread. The broiled version tastes like caramelized sugar, a slight char at the crust, butter soaked into every pore. The instinct to use the broiler this way has nearly vanished from American cooking. Before instant pudding packets made it a 5-minute job, stovetop vanilla pudding was something you watched someone make from scratch. Milk, sugar, cornstarch, a wooden spoon that never stopped circling the bottom of the pot. You stood at the stove because you were allowed to lick the spoon when it was almost done, and because watching the pudding thicken, going from thin and liquid to thick and glossy, was a kind of slow kitchen magic. By the 1980s, Jell-O instant mixes had taken over most households, but in some kitchens the pudding still came off the stove warm. You ate it straight from the pot before it reached a bowl. Hot vanilla pudding has a depth that the cold, set version loses entirely. The woman who made it that way understood that. She is gone now, and the pot sits unused in a cabinet somewhere. Saltine crackers with butter and sugar required nothing more than an open pantry and 3 minutes, which is why every American kid made it when no adult was home. You pulled crackers from the inner wax paper sleeve, spread each one with butter from the counter dish, never a cold stick because cold butter tore the cracker, then shook white sugar over and pressed it lightly so it stuck. The saltine dates to 1876, when the F.L. Summer Company of St. Joseph, Missouri, produced the first commercial salted cracker. In the 1980s, before snack aisles expanded into entire wings of grocery stores, this was what kids reached for when the kitchen offered nothing better. It cost almost nothing. It vanished not because anyone decided to stop, just because the pantry stopped having all 3 things ready at once. But if saltine crackers were what you made alone on a slow Tuesday, Velveeta nachos were what happened when someone's older sister decided the whole afternoon needed to be an occasion. Velveeta had been in American kitchens since 1928, engineered by the Monroe Cheese Company to melt smoothly without breaking, a quality that real cheddar could never reliably deliver. By the early 1980s, as Tex-Mex flavor spread into the mainstream, Velveeta found its true calling. You laid tortilla chips across a plate, hacked the block into rough slabs over them, and slid the whole thing into the oven or the microwave. The microwave version came out with orange pooling and a slight skin on top that meant it was done. Real cheese splits, browns, and goes stringy. Velveeta stayed perfect and patient. You can still buy the block, but nobody makes it this way anymore. Chips spread across the plate, the block cut by hand, everyone crowded around before it cooled. Cream cheese on date nut bread was a snack that belonged to grandmother's kitchens in church bazaars, the kind of place where the bread came wrapped in wax paper and sat on the counter all week. Date nut bread, dense and dark with the sweetness of medjool dates and the crunch of pressed walnuts, was sold in small cylindrical loaves through the 1960s and 70s. You spread Philadelphia cream cheese on those rounds the way you'd spread it on a bagel, only thicker. Philadelphia cream cheese had been produced since 1872, originally made in Chester, New York by dairyman William Lawrence, and by the 1980s it was the default American spread for anything needing richness without effort. The cream cheese against the sweet, heavy date crumb created something far more considered than it was. By the 1980s, date nut bread had started its long disappearance from bakery shelves, pushed out by muffins and convenience loaves. The grandmother who kept it stopped buying it when it became hard to find, and then she was gone too. Wonder Bread pinwheels required a rolling pin, a refrigerator, and patience, which is why they felt like an achievement when you got them right. You pressed the rolling pin across a fresh slice until it was almost paper thin, spread it to the edges with cream cheese or thin sliced ham, rolled it tight from one end, and refrigerated it for 20 minutes. Then out, sliced on a diagonal, each round holding its shape. Wonder Bread, introduced by the Taggart Baking Company of Indianapolis in 1921, was specifically engineered soft enough to compress without tearing. The softness critics mocked was the entire structural point. Whole wheat wouldn't roll. Sourdough shattered. The pinwheel was one of the few things a child in the 1980s could make from scratch that looked like party food. The technique required actual skill, feel for the right pressure, the right amount of filling, and once kitchens moved on, no one thought to teach it again. Frozen orange juice popsicles made in ice cube trays with toothpicks came out of the post-war American kitchen, where the chest freezer was new and the idea of making your own frozen treats was still a genuine discovery. You poured diluted Minute Maid concentrate into each slot, 1 can concentrate, 3 cans water, pressed a flat toothpick into the center, and carried the tray level to the freezer. The trick was the toothpick standing straight before the juice started setting. Minute Maid had introduced frozen concentrated orange juice commercially in 1946, a technology developed during World War II to ship juice to troops overseas without spoilage, and by the 1980s it sat in nearly every American freezer. Otter Pops and Fudgsicles were the commercial replacement, cheaper, already frozen, but they tasted like approximations. The toothpick version tasted like what you'd poured into a glass that morning. The real thing, just colder. Chocolate milk made with Hershey's syrup was never just chocolate milk. It was a ratio, and everyone who grew up making it had their own and was willing to argue about it. You tilted the squeeze bottle, counted to a number, and stirred until the dark pool at the bottom lifted. Stop too soon, and you'd drink thin milk, then hit pure sweetness at the end. Hershey's syrup had been sold in tin cans since 1926, but in 1979 the company switched to the plastic squeeze bottle, the only version every 80s kid knew. The school cafeteria's chocolate milk was too uniform. The kind you made at home had variation, and you learned to correct for it pour by pour. Most kitchens don't keep a squeeze bottle anymore. The muscle memory for the count has gone quiet. Cottage cheese with canned peaches was the after-school snack that arrived with the 1970s fitness wave and stayed through the 80s without ever becoming fashionable, which is how most genuinely useful things work. You spooned large curd cottage cheese into a bowl, always large curd, never small, then opened the Del Monte or Dole can of sliced peaches in heavy syrup and laid them over the top without draining. The syrup ran into the curds and pooled at the bottom of the bowl. Cottage cheese had been marketed as diet food since the early 1970s, when the first serious American fitness movement made its push into everyday life, and the peach pairing was that era's answer to dessert for the disciplined. It tasted better than it sounded. But the woman who kept both a carton of cottage cheese and a row of Del Monte cans simultaneously ready, always both, always waiting, is the part that's gone. Cold leftover biscuits had their own logic in a Southern kitchen. Breakfast biscuits were for the morning, but day-old biscuits were denser and slightly dried at the crust, better suited to cold butter and preserved fruit that made them an afternoon snack. You split them with your thumbs, never a knife. Cold butter went into the crumb and softened in seconds. Then a heavy spoon of fig or strawberry preserves from a mason jar put up in August. Across the South and into Appalachia, biscuit making was the skill that separated a real cook from someone who could just follow directions. You learned by feel, by the look of the dough, by how it pulled from the bowl. The preserves came from fruit grown close by or given as a gift. Both skills, the biscuit and the put-up fruit, began leaving kitchens in the 1980s as convenience baking and store-bought jam made the from-scratch versions feel unnecessary. They were not unnecessary. Pizza toast on white bread was what every American kid made in the years before Bagel Bites, and it was better in every way that mattered. You spread contadina or Hunt's tomato paste, not pizza sauce, not marinara, but the concentrated paste from the small can, across a slice of white bread, covered it with shredded mozzarella, and slid it under the broiler. 4 minutes watching. The cheese went from white to spotted to pulling away at the corners, and when it browned at the edges while still soft in the center, it was ready. Bagel Bites launched in 1985, created by two brothers in Hallandale, Florida, and within a few years became the commercial standard for after-school pizza snacking. Before that, the pizza toast was what you made yourself, how much paste, how thick the cheese, whether to shake oregano from the jar above the stove. The homemade version didn't disappear because it was inferior. It disappeared because the commercial one required no watching. Peanut butter and banana on Wonder Bread was the everyday version of something Elvis Presley had made famous by frying. But in the 1980s, most kids ate it cold and unadorned, pressed flat before being cut into rectangles, never triangles. You spread the peanut butter thick enough to hold the banana slices in place, laid them in a single layer, and ate it standing at the counter before the bread had time to go soggy. The banana had to be ripe, but not soft. A soft banana turned the bread wet in minutes, and you learned that by ruining one. Presley's documented preference was for his version fried in butter with bacon and honey, a recipe associated with his childhood in Tupelo, Mississippi. The cold version your mother made after school had none of that richness. What it had was speed, and it was ready before you'd finished dropping your backpack on the floor. Eating cereal dry was not a snack you invented. It was something you discovered, usually by accident, when you opened the box intending to pour it and then just didn't bother with the milk. Lucky Charms, Cap'n Crunch, Cocoa Puffs, whatever was in the cabinet, eaten by the handful straight from the bowl. The marshmallows in Lucky Charms were better dry. Everyone who grew up in the 1980s knew this, and nobody said it out loud because it seemed too obvious to mention. You picked out the marshmallows first, ate them separately, then finished the grain pieces as a kind of bland dessert. Cap'n Crunch was the dangerous one. The squares cut the roof of your mouth if you let them sit too long on your tongue. You developed strategies. Nobody taught you. By the early 1990s, cereal companies had begun marketing certain varieties explicitly as dry snacks, which meant the private discovery had become a product strategy. Before Jell-O pudding pops had their own freezer section, some kitchens were already making the homemade version. And the homemade version was the reason the commercial one felt like such a revelation when it finally arrived. You cooked a box of Jell-O cook-and-serve chocolate pudding on the stove, let it cool until just warm, spooned it into Dixie cups, pressed a popsicle stick into the center of each one, and carried them flat to the freezer. 5 hours later, they were done. General Foods launched Jell-O Pudding Pops commercially in 1979, and the product earned $100 million in its first year, driven by Bill Cosby's television endorsement. But the commercial version was manufactured for consistency, not for the slightly grainy, intensely chocolatey result that came from the stovetop method and a home freezer. Kids who had made the homemade version and then tasted the commercial one knew something was different. The homemade one tasted like something had been put into it by hand. Stovetop caramel popcorn required patience, and most kitchens that made it in the 1970s and 80s had plenty of the will, but not always the skill, which is why there were so many batches that came out too sticky, too dark, or hardened into an unmovable mass. You popped the corn in a covered pot, poured it into the largest bowl in the house, then cooked butter, brown sugar, and corn syrup in a saucepan until it reached what cooks called the soft crack stage, between 270 and 290 degrees Fahrenheit. You poured the caramel over the popcorn and tossed fast before it set. The woman who made it right could tell the temperature by the color of the syrup and the way it fell from the spoon. No thermometer. Cracker Jack had been selling commercial caramel corn since 1896, but the homemade version off a gas burner tasted nothing like it. That particular stovetop skill stopped being passed down sometime in the 1980s, and caramel popcorn became something you bought. Canned Vienna sausages eaten cold from the can were the after-school snack no child would admit to liking if anyone from school was watching, which is exactly why they tasted so good alone in the kitchen on a Thursday. You pried the pull tab, heard the hiss of brine, and ate them straight from the can with a fork or your fingers, standing over the sink. They came from Armour Star or Libby's, packed 6 to a can in pale salt solution. They carried a distant connection to the Vienna sausage tradition that German and Austrian immigrants had brought to American cities in the mid-1800s, though what came out of the Armour can in 1983 bore little resemblance to what a Viennese butcher produced in 1850. The can was the point. The eating over the sink was the point. The not telling anyone was the point. Nobody makes a snack of them now. Campbell's condensed tomato soup made with milk instead of water was not a recipe so much as a piece of household knowledge, the kind of thing your mother did without mentioning it, that you only noticed when you made it with water at a friend's house and wondered why it tasted flat. The label had always offered the option, right there on the red and white can, milk or water. The milk version came out creamy and pale orange-pink, and it needed watching on the stove because it would scorch at high heat if you let your attention drift. Campbell's had been making condensed tomato soup since 1897, when chemist John Dorrance developed the condensing process that made it shelf-stable and affordable for ordinary households. The milk variation had been part of the kitchen tradition almost as long, never the official way, but the way certain households did it, passed from one cook to the next without instruction. You didn't read it in a cookbook. You watched someone do it, and then you did it, and then the next person watched you. The soup is still there. The knowledge of the milk is fading. RC Cola with salted peanuts poured inside the bottle was not invented in any kitchen. It was a tradition discovered on front porches and at country stores, passed from person to person by demonstration, never by instruction. You took a sip or two to make room, tore the corner off a sleeve of Tom's or Lance salted peanuts, and tilted them in slowly. Then you drank and ate simultaneously, each sip carrying 2 or 3 peanuts with it, sweet and salty and carbonated all at once. Food historians trace the practice to Southern textile mill workers in the 1920s who needed a hands-off snack that let them eat without stopping work or washing their hands. Some insisted on Coca-Cola, some swore by RC Cola for its slightly sweeter finish. The combination was called, by people who knew it, the working man's strawberries in champagne. Most of the country has never tried it. Most of the people who grew up with it don't make it anymore. And if the peanut and cola tradition came from fields and front porches, the frozen Welch's grape juice cup came from a different kitchen entirely. A mother trying to give her children something cold in August when the ice cream budget had run out. You poured Welch's Concord grape juice into Dixie cups, pressed a popsicle stick into each one, and put them in the freezer for 4 hours. The Welch's Cooperative had been founded in 1869 in Westfield, New York, built around the Concord grape variety developed by Ephraim Bull in the 1850s. When the cups froze, the flavor concentrated near the top as the ice formed, so the first bites were the sweetest. You learned to rotate them as they melted. Everyone who made them figured that out. Nobody had to be told. Sorghum syrup on buttered toast was an Appalachian and rural Southern kitchen tradition that had been fading since the 1960s, when Log Cabin and Mrs. Butterworth's pancake syrups began appearing in grocery stores and seemed like a simpler answer to the same question. Sorghum, pressed from the stalks of Sorghum bicolor, a grass brought to North America from West Africa in the 1600s, produced a thick, dark, slightly bitter syrup with an earthiness that no corn-based syrup could replicate. You buttered the toast while hot, then spooned the sorghum over and watched it spread slowly, pooling at the edges. The flavor was complex the way single-ingredient things often are, sweet but not simple, with a molasses depth that hit the back of the palate. By the 1980s, sorghum was a specialty item found at farm stands and Appalachian country stores, rather than regular grocery aisles. The grandmothers who had grown up on it still kept a jar. When they stopped keeping the jar, the knowledge of what to do with it stopped too. Apricot preserves spooned straight onto saltine crackers was a pantry snack that required exactly the right jar to be on the right shelf at the right time, which meant it was either always available in certain households or never available at all, depending entirely on whether someone kept preserved fruit as a regular staple. You used a generous spoon rather than a spreading knife because the cracker required speed. Moisture from the preserves began softening it within about 90 seconds, and the window between the perfect, crisp, sweet bite and a soggy mess was narrow enough that you learned to eat fast. Smucker's, founded in Orrville, Ohio in 1897 by Jerome Monroe Smucker, had been producing fruit preserves since the early 1900s, and apricot was among the original varieties. The snack required no cooking, no preparation, no skill beyond the spoon. It was the kind of thing you made the first time by accident and the second time on purpose. It doesn't show up on anyone's list of nostalgic favorites. That's exactly the point. Underwood deviled ham, spread on Ritz crackers, was a snack that required nothing more than a can opener and a box of crackers. No stove, no mess, no permission needed. The red devil on the Underwood can was a logo that American kitchens had known since the 1860s. Underwood holds the distinction of being the oldest surviving trademarked food brand in the United States, with its trademark registered in 1868. The deviled ham was finely ground smoked ham mixed with mustard and spices, with a heat that built slowly after the first cracker. On Ritz crackers, introduced by Nabisco in 1934, the buttery cracker and the spiced meat created something that tasted like it should cost more than it did. By the 1980s, the Red Devil can had been in American pantries for over a century. A generation later, it had nearly vanished from them. Cold cornbread crumbled into a glass of cold milk was a dish that traveled between generations without anyone deciding to teach it. You saw someone do it once, understood immediately that it was right, and never thought of it as a recipe because it wasn't one. You broke the cornbread into rough pieces over the glass, pressed them down until the milk came up around them, and ate with a spoon before the bread could absorb too much. The tradition ran deep through the rural South and into Appalachia, where it was called crumble-in, and where it existed at the intersection of breakfast and supper and between meal hunger without belonging to any of them. The cornbread had to be unsweetened. Northern sweet cornbread dissolved too fast. The Southern style, made with stone-ground white cornmeal and no sugar, held its shape long enough to give you something to chew. Cold, filling, ready in 45 seconds. The kitchens where this was understood are going quiet, one by one. But if cornbread and milk was the snack of one kind of kitchen, broiled grapefruit with brown sugar belonged to a different one entirely. The kind where someone was always watching their figure, always reading about health, always trying to find something that felt indulgent without actually being so. You halved the grapefruit, ran a knife around each section to loosen it from the membrane, covered the cut face with brown sugar, and slid it under the broiler until the sugar melted and caramelized at the edges. The broiled grapefruit appeared in American cookbooks as far back as the 1920s, when grapefruit first gained its reputation as a weight loss food, and it moved into the diet culture of the 1970s and 80s as a snack that felt almost like dessert. The heat softened the fruit and drew out the juice, and the caramelized sugar cut through the bitterness in a way that plain sugar never did. You don't see it made anymore. The magazine is gone. The woman who read it is gone. The broiler still works fine. Potted meat on white bread with yellow mustard was the snack that asked nothing of the kitchen except a knife and a loaf of bread, and it was the one that showed up when the pantry was nearly empty and payday was still 2 days away. Armour Star potted meat food product, That full legal name, in small print on the pull-top can, was a cooked minced meat product sealed in its own gelatin and salt. You spread it thick on a slice of Wonder Bread, covered it with a bright stripe of French's yellow mustard, folded the bread over, and ate it in 4 bites. It cost less than $1 a can in the 1980s, on the bottom shelf where the cheapest things lived. In kitchens where money was short and children were hungry, it was never nothing. It was the thing between now and dinner, the thing that kept the afternoon from becoming a problem. Nobody calls it a snack. It was one. Stovetop hot cocoa made from scratch, cocoa powder, sugar, a pinch of salt, and milk heated slowly in a small saucepan, was the version that existed before Swiss Miss packets made the whole process feel unnecessary. You whisked the cocoa and sugar together in the dry pot first, added a little cold milk to make a paste, then poured in the rest and set it over low heat. You could not walk away from it. The milk scorched on the bottom if you stopped stirring, and scorched milk had a bitterness that followed the cocoa all the way through. Swiss Miss had been introduced in 1959 and achieved wide distribution through the 1970s, and by the mid-1980s, the instant packet had become standard in most American kitchens. What the scratch version gave you in return was a cocoa that tasted like the milk itself, slightly scalded at the surface, deeply chocolate, nothing powdery or thin. The packet is still in the cabinet. The saucepan for cocoa has not been used in years. Peanut butter balls rolled in powdered sugar were the no-bake confection that showed up in Southern church cookbooks from the 1950s onward, always attributed to someone's grandmother, always described as easy and always somehow more work than they sounded. You mixed Jif or Peter Pan peanut butter with softened butter and enough powdered sugar to make the dough hold a shape. The ratio was never written down in the version that mattered, which was the version in someone's head. You rolled the mixture into balls the size of a walnut, then rolled them through additional powdered sugar until coated white. They went into the refrigerator to firm. They were associated with Christmas in most households, which made them a surprise when they appeared in October, which is when someone who missed her grandmother most always seemed to make them. The recipe is still in the cookbook. The hands that knew the ratio by feel are not. Saltine cracker candy. Saltines lined on a foil-covered sheet pan, covered in butter and brown sugar toffee, topped with chocolate chips that melted in the residual heat and spread smooth. Circulated through church basements and community cookbooks in the 1970s and 80s under a dozen different names before the internet settled on calling it Christmas crack. You boiled the butter and brown sugar together for exactly 3 minutes, poured it over the crackers, slid the pan into a 350-degree oven for 5 minutes, while the toffee bubbled into the salt of the crackers, then poured the chocolate chips over while still hot and spread them as they melted. The transformation from plain crackers and pantry sugar into something that tasted like expensive toffee was the kind of alchemy that made a cook feel like they had discovered something. Most of them had learned it from someone else. Most of those someone else's are gone. Raw apple slices dipped in a bowl of plain white sugar was the simplest after-school snack in the entire American 1980s, and it was the one most likely to go unremembered precisely because it required no skill, no heat, and no story, just an apple, a knife, and a bowl of sugar from the canister on the counter. You cut the apple into wedges and dragged each one through the sugar and bit through the crisp flesh into the sweetness that clung to the cut face. The red delicious apple dominated American grocery stores and backyard trees through the 1980s, a variety developed in Iowa in the 1880s, selected for its appearance rather than its flavor, which meant it was never quite as good as it looked but was always available and always cheap. The sugar made it better than it was. The kitchen counter where the sugar canister lived, the particular chair you pulled up to reach it, the sound of the apple against the knife.
Since the swinging 60s, Hostess fruit pies have been pocket-sized parcels of joy, bursting with fruity goodness. Their handheld design made them a convenient option for on-the-go snacking without sacrificing flavor. These pies became the quintessential treat for those on the move, marrying convenience with the classic flavors of home-baked desserts. The addition of comic book advertisements further cemented their place in popular culture, making them a nostalgic treat for many. Despite changes in the snack food landscape, Hostess fruit pies remain popular, continuing to offer a sweet slice of nostalgia.
If you're from Colorado and a baseball fan, you might remember Rocky Mountain oysters, which are a lot more questionable than they sound. Essentially, these are the testicles of bulls, which have been skinned, coated in flour and batter, and deep fried. As an appetizer, they were common at baseball games in the state, but it was a relatively local favorite that did not see much love in other places, even in the 70s. Cobbler had already been popular enough in Atlanta, so it would be natural that, like key lime, peach cobbler bites would become a thing too. Definitely popular in African American communities, as these were an affordable and easy way to have something nice at cookouts. Kids may not have particularly liked them, but adults in their 30s went head over heels for the bites. For more in the box food that is not as out there as Rocky oysters, let's have some snickerdoodles. Coated with cinnamon and the type to crumble wonderfully in your mouth, these were really popular cookies in Connecticut. Platters of these for some weeknight baking would make for some very wonderful confectionaries in the 70s.
Beechnut fruit stripe gum dazzled the 1960s with its rainbow of flavors and whimsical tattoos, making each stick an adventure in taste and temporary art. The vibrant colors of the gum strips match their fruity flavors, making each piece a visual and taste sensation. The inclusion of temporary tattoos in each pack added to its appeal, offering more than just a chewing experience. Despite its flavors being short-lived, Fruit Stripe Gum's vibrant packaging and the fun of the temporary tattoos have left a lasting impression on those who grew up with it, evoking fond memories of a simpler time when even a stick of gum could bring a burst of joy and color to a child's day.
Stepping away from the fryer and looking more into the drier side of food, trail mixes were a Californian favorite, and they were just a mix of different dry fruits. Almonds, raisins, dates, and pecan or pumpkin seeds you could customize to your heart's desire. Easy to see why something with so much potential for personalization became so popular in a decade all about experimentation. For more in the box food that is not as out there as Rocky oysters, let's have some snickerdoodles. Coated with cinnamon and the type to crumble wonderfully in your mouth, these were really popular cookies in Connecticut. Platters of these for some weeknight baking would make for some very wonderful confectionaries in the 70s.
During the disco decade of the 1970s, space food sticks took off like a rocket, igniting dreams of interstellar travel with every bite. They bridged the gap between the fantasy of space exploration and everyday snacking, making them a product of their time. These nutritious, portable snacks were designed for astronauts, offering earthbound consumers the chance to experience a taste of space adventure. Although no longer in production, the legacy of space food sticks lives on as a symbol of a time when the final frontier seemed within reach, and snacks could be a part of that journey, blending nutrition with the thrill of exploration.
Arizona would eventually borrow from Tex-Mex cuisine when chimichanga started becoming a regular sight at almost any Latin American restaurant. Fusion joints or roadside stalls, everyone would be selling some kind of chimichanga, which is a deep-fried burrito. Filled with green veggies and sauces, 6 out of 10 people in the street would pick one up on their way to work in the 70s. If you're from Colorado and a baseball fan, you might remember Rocky Mountain oysters, which are a lot more questionable than they sound. Essentially, these are the testicles of bulls, which have been skinned, coated in flour and batter, and deep fried. As an appetizer, they were common at baseball games in the state, but it was a relatively local favorite that did not see much love in other places, even in the 70s. Idaho likes to keep it simple, like Hawaii, which is pretty respectable because for them, just potato skins with bacon and cream was the real American dream. Nothing more, nothing less. These light and appetizing potato skins were so popular in the 70s that kids ate almost nothing else.
In the 1970s, Figurines diet bars were at the forefront of the health and fitness trend, offering a snack option that didn't compromise on taste. Their slim profile and diet-friendly branding catered to a growing awareness of health and nutrition. These bars provided a guilt-free way to indulge in flavors like chocolate, vanilla, and peanut butter, appealing to those conscious of their dietary choices. Figurines stood out for their focus on calorie control and convenience, marking a significant moment in the evolution of diet snacks. Today, they are remembered for their role in shaping a more health-conscious approach to snacking, blending the desire for indulgence with the need for balance.
Cobbler had already been popular enough in Atlanta, so it would be natural that, like key lime, peach cobbler bites would become a thing too. Definitely popular in African American communities, as these were an affordable and easy way to have something nice at cookouts. Kids may not have particularly liked them, but adults in their 30s went head over heels for the bites. Arizona would eventually borrow from Tex-Mex cuisine when chimichangas started becoming a regular sight at almost any Latin American restaurant. Fusion joints or roadside stalls, everyone would be selling some kind of chimichanga, which is a deep-fried burrito. Filled with green veggies and sauces, 6 out of 10 people in the street would pick one up on their way to work in the 70s. Boardwalk fries are actually another platter-filling item that was the primary cause for people's metabolism skyrocketing back in the 70s. Boardwalk fries were not typically cooked like just any old basket of fries. These were dipped in vinegar and cold water before being fried twice in the fryer, resulting in what was an extremely soft yet very crispy fry people would always get with their burger.
Hubba Bubba swaggered onto the bubblegum stage in '79, ready to revolutionize the bubble-blowing biz with its non-stick formula and audacious flavors. Its unique formula made it easier for kids to clean up after blowing giant bubbles, enhancing its appeal. Its introduction of bold flavors and engaging commercials featuring bubble-blowing contests quickly made it a favorite among kids and teens. The brand's focus on fun and innovation has helped it maintain a special place in the hearts of those who remember the joy and playfulness of competing to blow the biggest bubble, making Hubba Bubba a symbol of the carefree days of youth.
Stepping away from the fryer and looking more into the drier side of food, trail mixes were a Californian favorite, and they were just a mix of different dry fruits. Almonds, raisins, dates, and pecan or pumpkin seeds you could customize to your heart's desire. Easy to see why something with so much potential for personalization became so popular in a decade all about experimentation. Salmon is such a widely caught fish in Alaska that salmon beef jerky should barely come as a surprise. Eggs, salmon beef jerky with a side of toast, was a cheap and common breakfast in diners and pubs in the state in the 70s. People would often have slices of beef jerky and use it in other dishes too, like casseroles or meatloafs.
With a name as loud as its packaging, Screaming Yellow Zonkers burst onto the snack scene in 1968. The unique combination of sweet and buttery flavors set it apart from traditional savory popcorn snacks. Packaged in an eye-catching black box, it offered a sweet and buttery twist to popcorn that quickly won over popcorn enthusiasts. The boxes, adorned with playful and irreverent humor, became collectible items in their own right. Despite its departure from the market, the legend of Screaming Yellow Zonkers lives on, a testament to a time when snacks could dare to be different and laughter was as important as taste.
Deep frying things and vegetables would not stop at just that, because in Arkansas, fried pickles were the new mood of the week in the 70s. Just plain dill pickles that would be battered. Then deep fried, you could get baskets of these in food streets or in family gatherings as a side dish. Kind of something that hit its peak back in those ages, but it was pretty delicious.
Imagine a dessert that defies gravity, layering itself into a trio of textures as if by magic. Launched into the culinary cosmos in 1969, Jell-O 1-2-3 became an instant classic, with its whimsical layers capturing the imagination of families nationwide. This innovative dessert offered a unique eating experience, from the airy and light top layer to the creamy middle, down to the classic Jell-O jiggle at the bottom. It epitomized the era's fascination with space-age technology, making dessert time a futuristic adventure. Although it has disappeared from store shelves, the legacy of Jell-O 1-2-3 endures, stirring nostalgia for a time when culinary creativity knew no bounds, and a simple dessert could captivate the imagination.
Deep frying things and vegetables would not stop at just that, because in Arkansas, fried pickles were the new mood of the week in the 70s. Just plain dill pickles that would be battered. Then deep fried, you could get baskets of these in food streets or in family gatherings as a side dish. Kind of something that hit its peak back in those ages, but it was pretty delicious. The pie itself did so well in family celebrations and bakeries that people came up with key lime pie bites, which were just bite-sized variants of the delicious dessert. Amazing as appetizers and amazing as snacks for sweet tooths, people would forget their civil sides around a fresh plate of these. The pie itself did so well in family celebrations and bakeries that people came up with key lime pie bites, which were just bite-sized variants of the delicious dessert. Amazing as appetizers and amazing as snacks for sweet tooths, people would forget their civil sides around a fresh plate of these.
Marathon bars hitting the shelves in 1973 stretched the very fabric of snack time with their ruler-embellished packaging and a generous 8-inch span of deliciousness. The long-lasting chew of Marathon bars offered consumers a unique and satisfying snacking experience. The combination of caramel and chocolate in a substantial, satisfying bar set it apart from other candy options. Its tagline, "Lasts a good long time," and distinctive packaging made it memorable. Despite being discontinued in the late 80s, Marathon bars are still fondly remembered for their size, taste, and innovative marketing, embodying the era's penchant for snacks that offered something extra.
Another one that had a head start in its state and an established presence was Spam in Hawaii, so Spam musubi was a natural evolution. Japanese-American restaurants would typically go the extra mile with wrapping it all on a block of rice with nori. Most people would have grilled Spam on their own, but this bite-sized version which completes our trinity was easily the best. Marshmallow fluff and sweet milk chocolate made moon pies a snack that people in Alabama just could not let go. Some people would spice theirs up with graham crackers, and the dark chocolate sauce was simply to die for. School kids, particularly teenagers, would always have a couple of packs of moon pies as they were bus ride comfort food. Idaho likes to keep it simple, like Hawaii, which is pretty respectable because for them, just potato skins with bacon and cream was the real American dream. Nothing more, nothing less. These light and appetizing potato skins were so popular in the 70s that kids ate almost nothing else.
Since their grand debut in 1930, Twinkies have danced their way into the hearts of Americans, becoming a beloved snack legend. Their ability to adapt to ingredient shortages during wartime highlighted the brand's resilience and ingenuity. Originally filled with banana cream, a wartime banana shortage necessitated a switch to vanilla cream, a change that contributed to the snack's iconic status. Twinkies became known for their longevity and adaptability, surviving changes in consumer preferences and even a brief discontinuation in 2012. Today, they remain a beloved treat, embodying the comfort and nostalgia of American snack food with their golden sponge cake and creamy filling, continuing to delight generations of snackers.
Salmon is such a widely caught fish in Alaska that salmon beef jerky should barely come as a surprise. Eggs, salmon beef jerky with a side of toast, was a cheap and common breakfast in diners and pubs in the state in the 70s. People would often have slices of beef jerky and use it in other dishes too, like casseroles or meatloafs. You have heard of caramel popcorn with regular salted popcorn, but Chicago mix popcorn, which you can find anywhere in Illinois, takes it up a notch. Cheddar cheese and caramel popcorn mixed together made for some loud theaters because people could not stop munching. Maybe just a bit too savory, those kinds of flavors did do well in the 1970s. Another one that had a head start in its state and an established presence was Spam in Hawaii, so Spam musubi was a natural evolution. Japanese-American restaurants would typically go the extra mile with wrapping it all on a block of rice with nori. Most people would have grilled Spam on their own, but this bite-sized version which completes our trinity was easily the best.
Recall the excitement of unwrapping a Marathon bar or the joy of chewing a piece of Hubba Bubba. These snacks were more than just treats, they were a part of our culture. It's time to celebrate the unforgettable flavors.
Ants on a log needed no oven, no stove, and no supervision beyond a mother with 10 minutes and a jar of peanut butter. You spread it thick into the groove of each celery stalk, then pressed raisins in one by one until they looked like insects marching in a line. It showed up in home economics classes by the 1960s and became an after-school staple through the next decade. Some mothers used cream cheese instead. A few let their kids assemble their own, which guaranteed twice as many raisins ended up in mouths as on the celery. The crunch, the salt, the sweetness. It was the kind of snack that made you feel like somebody had thought about you before you walked through the door. She started shaping it the night before, always the night before. You might have heard of Kentucky bourbon before, but brace your ears for bourbon balls. Coated in dark chocolate and filled with nuts and other crunchy ingredients, this would use half a cup of bourbon. Not one to keep around the children, but for people who did eat it, a typical 24-ball serving was the difference between a comforting movie night and being bored on a Saturday. You might be able to sue crab chips for false advertising, because on one hand they do taste delicious, but on the other they do not have any crab in them. Maryland Old Bay seasoning, which is commonly associated with crab dishes, is what these potato chips are covered in. Whatever it is, it works, and it works too good, because these things were mouth-watering, crunchy, and just the right amount of tangy. Boston Baked Beans candy, just like crab chips, specializes in being easy to consume and make in bulk. Originally starting out in Massachusetts as peanuts that were coated in candy, which gave them a sweet crunch, they got popular enough to get packaged variants. Grocery stores would be filled with two things: kids and frustrated parents trying to haggle with them for one packet less in the 70s.
Freaky's cereal leapt onto the breakfast scene in 1972, bringing a motley crew of characters and a bounty of toys that transformed bowls into playgrounds. The playful packaging and marketing of Freaky's cereal appealed to children's imaginations, making breakfast more than just a meal. The inclusion of collectible toys in each box turned breakfast into an exciting adventure, making Freaky's more than just a cereal. This innovative approach to marketing, along with the memorable characters and tasty cereal, created a cult following. While Freaky's may no longer be on store shelves, the nostalgia for this cereal and its whimsical world remains strong, with collectors and fans still cherishing the memories and memorabilia from their childhood breakfasts. Chunky chocolate bars, with their distinctive silver foil wrapping and unique trapezoid shape, have been a favorite since the 1930s. Their dense composition provided a satisfyingly rich bite that was both indulgent and filling. The combination of milk chocolate, raisins, and nuts in a thick, chunky size offered a rich and satisfying snacking experience. Chunky's memorable name and substantial offering set it apart in the candy world, making it a treat to savor. Despite the changing tastes and trends in confectionery, Chunky chocolate bars have maintained their appeal, continuing to offer a bite of nostalgia and a reminder of the simple pleasures of a well-crafted candy bar.
The cheese ball was the centerpiece of every 1970s party table, and making one meant softening 2 blocks of cream cheese, folding in sharp cheddar, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and sometimes diced onion. You mixed it by hand, formed it into a round the size of a softball, wrapped it tight, and chilled it overnight so the flavors settled. The next day, you rolled it in crushed pecans until every surface was covered and set it on a plate surrounded by Ritz crackers. Cheese balls in America trace back to 1801, when citizens of Cheshire, Massachusetts, presented a 1,200-pound wheel to President Jefferson. The 70s version was modest, but at every holiday gathering, every cookout, there it sat. The woman who brought the best one knew it, and everyone else did too. Nobody fought over recipes louder than they fought over whose cheese ball belonged at the center of the table. That same butter from the cheese ball found its way into a saucepan the next morning, melted with brown sugar, corn syrup, and a pinch of salt until it bubbled into something golden. From a state that loves barbecue pork ribs, has its own Kansas-style barbecue, it is no surprise that Kansas adores barbecue corn chips. Essentially just corn-flavored chips that have a gracious amount of barbecue seasoning sprinkled onto them, these were the definition of munchies. 1970. Kansas saw such a spike in popularity for these that store shelves would often be empty. You might have heard of Kentucky bourbon before, but brace your ears for bourbon balls. Coated in dark chocolate and filled with nuts and other crunchy ingredients, this would use half a cup of bourbon. Not one to keep around the children, but for people who did eat it, a typical 24-ball serving was the difference between a comforting movie night and being bored on a Saturday. The first kernel hit the oil, and you counted 1, 2, 3. Then the rest followed like a drum roll under a heavy lid. Stovetop popcorn was the sound of a Friday night, made in a deep pot with a few tablespoons of vegetable oil and a quarter cup of yellow kernels shaken hard over a gas flame until the popping slowed to silence. You learned the timing by ear. Too soon, and half the kernels sat unpopped. Too late, and the whole batch scorched. The finish came after. a full stick of melted butter poured slow while you shook the bowl, then enough salt to make your fingers white. Before Orville Redenbacher introduced his gourmet kernels in 1970, this was the only way popcorn happened in most homes. The heavy pot, the oil, the shaking, 5 minutes, almost nothing spent. Kids today will never know what it sounded like to stand in that kitchen, waiting for the last pop. 3:30 in the afternoon, the screen door banging shut, and there they were. Celery sticks already filled and lined up on a plate. Who can ever say no to corn, especially roasted corn kernel? Corn nuts would be very popular whenever it was harvest time in Iowa, and for kids these would be a great snack to make the school bus easier. Available in street stalls around the corners or in packets and cans, they proved that Iowa is one state very serious about its corn. Donuts and America are such a classic pairing that it is a no-brainer why Louisiana loves its beignets. Deep-fried donuts that would be caked in cinnamon or other lovely toppings, it was the donut of every sweet lover's eye. Also, maybe the bane of doctors who were sick of dealing with metabolism issues. Kids definitely were very pro-beignets and would devour these up anytime they found them. You have heard of moon pies. Now get ready for whoopie pies, which are similar to Spam musubi in concept actually. Maine would love the cream filling in the center sandwiched between two fluffy cookies that resembled mini chocolate cakes. Perfect for when you needed a hit to the brain to get it working or just felt like indulging in some gluttony. Homemade caramel corn started with plain popped kernels and a batch of stovetop caramel poured hot over the popcorn in a roasting pan. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, then slid it into a low oven, 250, for a full hour, pulling it out every 15 minutes to turn it. The baking soda was the secret. Half a teaspoon whisked into the caramel right before pouring made the coating puff up light and crisp instead of turning hard as glass. Families folded in roasted peanuts at the end, their own version of Cracker Jack, years before it came in foil bags at the convenience store. A pan cost less than $1 in 1973 and fed a living room full of kids without a single complaint. At every Thanksgiving spread, every Christmas Eve buffet, every funeral repast in the 70s, a relish tray held its place at the edge of the table, and stuffed celery was always on it. The filling was softened cream cheese beaten smooth, folded with chopped pimento-stuffed green olives and a little of the olive brine for sharpness. You spooned it into the curve of each stalk, then lined them up between carrot sticks and radish roses, the crunch of the celery against the tang of the olives, cold, crisp, and gone before the turkey was carved. Making the relish tray was the job of whoever arrived first, and the women who did it took quiet pride in how neatly the celery was cut, how evenly the filling sat. It was never the star of the table, but its absence was always noticed. The relish tray itself has all but vanished now, and the stuffed celery went with it. Donuts and America are such a classic pairing that it is a no-brainer why Louisiana loves its beignets. Deep-fried donuts that would be caked in cinnamon or other lovely toppings, it was the donut of every sweet lover's eye. Also, maybe the bane of doctors who were sick of dealing with metabolism issues. Kids definitely were very pro-beignets and would devour these up anytime they found them. Continuing the trend of mini-sized food, on this list breaded tenderloin sliders were these tiny bite-sized pork sandwiches that you could have at events or parties. Tenderloin sandwiches already did so well in Indiana, and it was an adored 2 p.m. lunch for young adults. In terms of accessibility, this made an already loved sandwich much easier to eat. Who can ever say no to corn, especially roasted corn kernel? Corn nuts would be very popular whenever it was harvest time in Iowa, and for kids these would be a great snack to make the school bus easier. Available in street stalls around the corners or in packets and cans, they proved that Iowa is one state very serious about its corn. Chex Party Mix was something you made at home, and every household had a version that was fiercely different from everyone else's. The base was always the same: rice and wheat Chex tossed with pretzel sticks and mixed nuts in a roasting pan. Then came the coating: melted butter, Worcestershire sauce, garlic salt, and onion powder stirred until the kitchen smelled sharp and warm. You baked it at 250 degrees, stirring every 15 minutes for almost an hour. The recipe ran on the back of the Chex box starting in the late 1950s. But by the 70s, every mother had her own adjustments: a splash of Tabasco, a handful of sesame sticks, a dusting of seasoned salt that made hers the one people asked for at church potlucks. You knew whose batch you were eating without being told. Nobody makes it from scratch anymore. The bags are easier, but they don't smell like her kitchen did. From a state that loves barbecue pork ribs, has its own Kansas-style barbecue, it is no surprise that Kansas adores barbecue corn chips. Essentially just corn-flavored chips that have a gracious amount of barbecue seasoning sprinkled onto them. These were the definition of munchies. 1970. Kansas saw such a spike in popularity for these that store shelves would often be empty. You measured nothing. A handful of peanuts, a handful of raisins, M&Ms poured in until the color looked right. Then you shook the bag and called it done. Gorp, good old raisins and peanuts, was the original trail mix. And through the 70s, it went everywhere families did. Into backpacks on scout trips, into station wagons on cross-country drives, into brown bags beside thermoses at Little League games. The combination of nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate as portable hiking food traces to at least the 1910s, when outdoorsman Horace Kephart recommended a similar mix in his camping guide. Every family had a version: sunflower seeds, coconut flakes, butterscotch chips instead of chocolate. The only rule was, you made it yourself and made enough to share. When trail mix appeared in pre-made bags at the gas station in the 80s, it stopped being something you assembled around the kitchen table. Nobody fought over the last handful of a gas station bag the way they fought over their mother's Gorp. Maybe just a bit too savory, those kinds of flavors did do well in the 1970s. Continuing the trend of mini-sized food, on this list breaded tenderloin sliders were these tiny bite-sized pork sandwiches that you could have at events or parties. Tenderloin sandwiches already did so well in Indiana, and it was an adored 2 p.m. lunch for young adults. In terms of accessibility, this made an already loved sandwich much easier to eat. Most people today wouldn't touch it, and that's exactly why it belonged on every serious cocktail tray in the 70s. Rumaki was chicken livers and water chestnuts marinated in soy sauce and brown sugar, wrapped in bacon, pinned with a toothpick, and broiled until the bacon crisped and the liver turned velvety. The dish was born at Don the Beachcomber in Palm Springs around 1941, riding the tiki wave that swept American entertaining for 3 decades. Trader Vic's put it on menus and it spread into rec rooms across the country. The contrast was everything: the crunch of water chestnut against rich liver, smoke of bacon against sweet marinade. Making a full tray meant handling raw liver without flinching, which separated the hosts who were serious from the ones who just opened a bag of chips. By the 80s, organ meats fell out of favor and rumaki disappeared almost overnight, from the center of the table to something most people have never heard of. You have heard of moon pies. Now get ready for whoopie pies, which are similar to Spam musubi in concept, actually. Maine would love the cream filling in the center sandwiched between 2 fluffy. Long before granola bars and fruit snacks filled the after-school hours, there was bread, butter, and a shaker jar of cinnamon sugar waiting on the counter. You buttered a slice of white bread edge to edge, shook the cinnamon sugar over it thick enough to see brown, and slid it under the broiler with the oven door cracked open so you could watch. 2 minutes, maybe 3. And the butter bubbled up through the sugar until the surface turned golden and the edges crisped. The smell was the whole house. Every kid in the neighborhood knew it. The cinnamon sugar shaker itself was a kitchen fixture, usually a recycled spice jar filled with a mix of 1 part cinnamon to 4 parts white sugar, and it lived next to the stove in every household that had children between 1960 and 1985. It cost almost nothing. It took less time than walking to the corner store. And for a 10-year-old standing at the counter in socks, watching the sugar melt through the oven door, it was the best thing anyone had ever made. Nobody admitted it was just 2 ingredients. That was the unspoken agreement of every 1970s party. You brought the dip, someone complimented it, and you accepted the praise like you'd spent hours in the kitchen. Lipton onion soup dip was 1 envelope of dried soup mix stirred into a pint of sour cream, chilled, and set out with ridged potato chips. Kraft printed the recipe on the packet in 1958, calling it California Dip, and within a decade it was the most popular dip in America. By the 70s, it showed up at every barbecue, every card party, every Super Bowl gathering, always in the same ceramic bowl, always with ruffles strong enough to hold a loaded scoop. Some women added a spoonful of mayo, others folded in chives. The base never changed, and the compliments never stopped. The pre-made dip aisle killed it, but the jar version never tasted the way hers did, and everybody knew it. None of those things belong to a recipe. They belong to a person. When that person is gone, it's just an apple and a bowl of sugar. That's not quite the same thing. These kitchens are nearly gone, and they took their knowledge with them. Which one do you still make?